Thank you very much for taking the time to join us on this lovely warm day to introduce some more detail about our Good Practice Lending Guide. I'm Diane Burridge and I work in our growth and development team at Fair4All Finance. I'm also really delighted to be joined by Lydia Edwards and Dr. Steve Finlay, who are lead consultants at J-Wing, who we partnered with to write the guide. We've collaborated with the J-Wing team on several areas of our work, and they've got to know the community finance sector well, which was really helpful when we were thinking about how to structure the content of the guide for it to be as practical and relevant a source of information as possible. We're very conscious that it continues to be a really volatile marketplace for lenders, how to manage risk, trying to lend sustainably, and trying to balance the needs of borrowers to get access to the right product for their circumstances. Whatever individual appetite for lending risk might be, or how firms are responding to regulatory change, lending well and managing credit risk is really a continuous journey. We hope that launching the guide provides a useful tool that brings all aspects of the good practice in lending together in one place. So, what are we going to cover in today's session? We'll start with a very brief reminder about the core parts of the work we do at Fair4All Finance. Then we'll move on to a little bit more about the background and the purpose of the guide. And then I'll hand over to J-Wing, the J-Wing team, to introduce the different modules and how to use the guide. Lydia and Steve will then run through a couple of deep dives on two specific modules, followed then by a Q&A break. Finally, we'll kind of wrap up with what else we're thinking about for further content in the second half of this year. Please do put any questions that you have in the chat as we go through. Don't wait until the end, and then we'll answer as many as we can with the time we have. And if needed, follow up afterwards on any that we don't manage to get to. So, just to kick us off as a quick reminder about our work at Fair4All Finance. We've identified that there are now over 20 million people in financially vulnerable circumstances. That's 44% of UK adults. We're really focused on changing the financial system to work better for the needs of the different groups of people within this 20 million. How do we aim to do this? Well, firstly, by investing in organisations that already serve this population well to help them grow and reach even more people. We really love to collaborate on partnerships and investments to develop new products and services to better serve the needs of those different groups. And then our ongoing research built a really rich evidence base to inform policy and regulation, and that helps to support the systemic change that's needed. The Good Practice Lending Guide forms part of our wider suite of guides and tools we've been putting together for the community finance sector. Other examples include our Sustainability Guide, our Customer Engagement Support Guide, and most recently our Leadership Learning Programme. More details about all of these can be found in the resources section of our website. We do update fairly regularly with new content, so it's always worth checking out when you get the chance. We created this guide to bring together into one reference point all aspects to consider when managing credit risk in a lending organisation. It's informed by a combination of insights we've gathered from the lending organisations that we've supported and good practice from the financial services sector as a whole. The guide spans the whole customer journey and life cycle, aspects of lending governance, key compliance areas to consider, and how to compile and analyse relevant management information. MI that can help evidence and inform current good practice, and then potentially also evolve into learnings that feed into future good practice. The guide is intended to be a one-stop, easy-to-use tool for the community finance sector. It includes some tailoring to make it more relevant and proportionate for small to medium not-for-profits, and brings both together practical examples and in-depth explanations of more complex areas. It's free. It's an easy to use and access resource. It's constructed in a modular way, and it looks at a range of topics. And we hope this makes it easier to take from the guide what's most relevant for your organisation and any specific areas that it's useful to focus on or learn more about. Now, I think that's quite enough talking for me, and it's about time I handed over to Dee from the J-Wing team, who'll take us through an overview of the content within the guide. But just a quick reminder again to put your questions into the chat for us to pick up at the Q&A break. Thanks, and over to you, Steve.
Thank you, Diane. My name's Steve Finlay, and I'm a consultant at J-Wing and was one of the main contributors to developing the guide in conjunction with Fair4All. For those of you who may not be familiar with J-Wing, we've been providing credit risk management analysis and consultancy services for over 25 years and have worked with a wide range of organisations in the UK, from small not-for-profits and fintech startups to some of the largest banks and building societies in the UK. I'll now take you through the structure of the guide and provide some more detail as to how we approach its development as a broad reaching resource tool targeted at the community finance sector. So the focus of the guide is predominantly on unsecured lending, mainly in the form of fixed term loans, but other forms of credit are also discussed. In terms of the structure of the guide, it contains an introduction that provides a high-level overview of the rest of the guide and introduces core concepts, such as the difference between regulated and unregulated lending as defined by the Consumer Credit Act. The introduction also presents a view of the UK retail credit landscape. So this includes the different types of institution that provide credit and the differences between them. For example, what differentiates a credit union from a building society, for example. The introduction also describes the regulatory landscape and the regulatory bodies that define the environment that firms operate within. So that includes the remit of the Financial Conduct Authority, the FCA, the Information Commissioner's Officer, the ICO, amongst other bodies that are involved in regulating credit in the UK. It also covers some of the organisations that support the industry. So that's both consumers and firms, for example, the role of debt charities and trade bodies. Finally, the introduction gives a short description of the material in each of the modules. So it just tells you briefly what each of the 15 modules contains. Each of the 15 modules covers one specific risk management topic, but refers the reader to other modules where there are areas of overlap or natural follow-on. For example, if we talk about lending policy, which is covered in modules 4 and 5, credit risk and affordability, those activities often involve services provided by credit reference agencies. So when reading modules 4 or 5, the reader is referenced to module 8 that covers the role and function of credit reference agencies at appropriate points. All the modules have been designed with a common structure and style. Each covers relevant regulatory and governance considerations, provides a simple introduction to its topic before moving on to more advanced aspects. Each module contains worked examples. This is very important because, interpreting dry regulations can be almost impossible sometimes without practical context to refer to. So examples are a real theme throughout. And then each module has a glossary of terms and abbreviations. I think what's important as well is that we've adopted a proportional approach. So this is in terms of what organisations which may have no more than a few dozen staff and maybe a balance sheet of only a few tens of millions can realistically achieve, versus what large banks with thousands of employees and billions of pounds on their balance sheets might be able to accomplish. In terms of style, we've tried to keep the language simple and concise. We do use regulatory terminology sometimes because we have to, but wherever possible, we've limited the use of complex terminology to aid understanding. So in terms of how to use the guide, I think what's really important to say right up front is that it is intended as a support tool. We're not looking to tell anybody what they must do. The guide captures our broad experience of what good practice looks like in industry, and we hope will be helpful to organisations working in the community finance sector and beyond. When writing the guide, we recognise there are several different audiences that we wanted to support in slightly different ways. And firstly, we saw it as a reference manual. We recognise that in the community finance space, organisations often just have a single person who is the expert on a specific topic. Or one person in an organisation has to be a jack of all trades, having lots of different responsibilities and perhaps not having any in-house experts to consult or bounce ideas off. And if we take credit scoring as an example of this, if you go to a typical high street bank, they will have whole departments containing dozens of experts, all devoted to refining and developing their credit scoring solutions. If you go to a small credit union, on the other hand, credit scoring and how that's applied may be just one of many responsibilities that the head of credit has. So hopefully the guide can help fill gaps in knowledge that people may have working in organisations. Secondly, we see it as an assurance tool. So, the regulations, and there are a lot of regulations in our industry, can be pretty dry, and they don't always provide organisationally relevant examples to follow or context about how the regulations are being interpreted across the industry. So what the PAC's doing, as it were. Great example, which we'll come on to discuss in more detail in a few minutes, is the concept of affordability. So in theory, affordability is simple. It's just the difference between income and expenditure. But the practical implementation of an affordability assessment requires consideration of many different customer product and organisational specific factors, and is much more complex in practice. We also see the guide as being available to new organisations. So the more organisations working in this space, the more products and services being offered to consumers, the better. As Diane said, this is a free resource that organisations can pick up and use. And then finally, as a learning resource for staff. So it's easy to forget staff often start from a position of very little industry knowledge, or are asked to take on new responsibilities that they need to be trained for. And in this sector in particular, we shouldn't forget the role of volunteers. They often contribute a huge amount to the community finance sector. And to ensure regulatory compliance and good customer outcomes, volunteers need to work to the same standards as paid staff. And we hope the guide will be a good resource for them to help them gain a greater understanding of the value of their roles and the standards that they need to adhere to as well. So that's hopefully a quick introduction to sort of the guide at a high level. What I'm now going to do is hand you over to my colleague Lydia Edwards, and she's going to take you through one of the modules in more detail. Lydia, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Hi everyone. So I'm Lydia Edwards and I'm a consultant at J-Wing. So I've written several of the modules of the guide. For my part today, I just want to take you through some of the elements of the affordability module. So it's probably worth pointing out at this stage that the entire guide is big. So the overall document runs well over 150,000 words, so it is rivaling a novel at this stage. And the affordability module alone runs to more than 70 pages. So within this time slot, I don't really have time to go and delve into every detail included in the guide. However, I'm aiming to provide an outline of the range of topics and issues relating to affordability that the guide covers, and also give some specific examples of the content. So in terms of content, the module covers all elements of affordability that require consideration, regardless of if a firm operates under CONC or CREDS. However, one thing I want to highlight, and I think Steve's touched upon this as well, is that the guide goes far beyond the regulations and the theoretical approach to affordability. So we've really tried to incorporate practical applications as a priority of the guide's content. So when it comes to affordability, for example, one practical consideration is the data organisations have available to them. So some firms will be really lucky and they'll have access to full open banking, which can provide detailed information on individuals' incomes. It can give a full breakdown of every expenditure item that they have, and the amount of systems in place that can automatically group all of this information into categories, which allows them to do an income and expenditure calculation. that's quite easy and can accurately assess the customer's affordability. However, we're very aware that a lot of firms don't have this level of data, and instead they must sort of make approximate assessments based on third-party data supplied by organisations such as credit reference agencies or ONS. So the guide provides guidance as to the approaches that can be undertaken given the data that is available. The guide also covers guidance on the treatment of joint and individual applications and how joint incomes and expenditures should be treated from a household perspective, because this can be a bit more difficult and a little bit more messy than an individual application, as there can be ambiguity in how household expenditures are assigned, and this is also discussed within the guide. We've also seen several FOSS cases where a pure affordability calculation based on just the absolute difference between the income and expenditure can be problematic and is not necessarily enough. So the guide also discusses the application of elements such as buffers to ensure customers have some headroom in that affordability calculation, and also stress testing, which can account for potential changes in the customer's circumstance over the life of the lending product. So to further support firms, we've included practical applications. So the guide provides several examples of affordability calculations across different scenarios. So for example, we've included some examples where a customer has an erratic income each month, and we've also looking at an application on an individual basis as well as a joint basis. So just on the next slide, so as I've mentioned, the document is large, so there's lots of topics in there, and I've picked 4 subtopics just to go into, and I'll discuss in a bit more detail to try and demonstrate the approach that we've taken. So within this slide, the bullets in black, they've been selected as the chapters in the guide, and then the orange bullets are subsections within that chapter. So I'll discuss these in a bit more detail in the next slides, but just as a brief summary, I'm going to first discuss how we've introduced affordability. So as with the other modules, we really don't assume the reader is an expert. So we begin with a gentle introduction to affordability and the core concepts, and then we build up from there throughout the guide. I'm going to talk through a more in-depth affordability calculation, and then I'll discuss sort of buffers and tolerances and how these could be applied, and then conclude with some learning points from previously upheld FOSS cases. So it's probably worth just pointing out at this stage that any extracts that we've included within this webinar, we've taken from the guide, but we've simplified them. So if you were to look at the Word document and read the guide thoroughly, then there'd be more details and more information included on these examples I'm about to go through. So the module introduces the concept of affordability. So the guide discusses how it is related to but different from credit risk, and how both these aspects of creditworthiness must be considered when you're providing a complete assessment of the customer. So this module itself just discusses affordability, but we also have a credit risk document, which is signposted to within the affordability module. So the basic affordability calculation is comprising of 2 main elements. So we have the income and expenditure, which represents a point in time view of the customer's finances. And then this guide then extends to introduce the concept of a stress factor. So this stress factor is there to account for anticipated changes in the future over the life of the loan of the customer's circumstances. So it's worth noting that I've included the stress factor here. It's included as an add-on rather than a subtraction, because for this stress factor, we want to include both positive and negative changes to affordability. So for instance, if we were talking about cost of living factors or a customer's taking out a new or bigger mortgage, then this may well be covered as a negative factor, as it's negatively affecting that customer's affordability. However, if the customer is aware that their income is going to increase in the short term, so maybe they're going to get a new job or a promotion, then this would be deemed a positive factor. And we think this should be considered as well, so long as they can provide the relevant evidence. So when we're considering both positive and negative stress factors, we think it's important because the primary goal of the sector is essentially to provide customers with a wider access to financial products and services in a responsible way. So we know, that we need to make financially prudent lending decisions to survive and provide as much benefit to customers and members as possible. However, if we don't include the positive elements as well, then we could be doing that customer a disservice. So if they are able to provide evidence that their financial position is expected to strengthen over time, and this can be verified, then this means that we have more scope to provide and meet their current credit needs. So this next slide is looking at a sort of working example. So after we've introduced the concept of affordability in the guide, we then look at sort of illustrations of how this could be used in practice. So this example on the slide here, it's a simplified extract taken from the guide and displays how the income and expenditure is calculated for a customer. So we have income amounts provided on the left-hand side and expenditure captured on the right. So the information from these calculations has been gathered from a variety of different sources. So some information has been provided by the customer, others from open banking, and some elements estimated using third-party data. So on the income side, we can see, okay, this customer has a main job. In this example, the main job contributes to around 75% of the overall individual's income, but they also have a secondary income, and we can see that they've got some savings and investments. And then when it comes to expenditure, these are described in terms of the split between non-discretionary and discretionary items. So as we can see in that example, these are clearly split out between the two and then further broken down into specific payments, such as credit card payments, loan payments, some council tax, and so on. So as the guide explains, the income and expenditure amounts provided cannot be taken at face value. They must be evidenced and verified as accurate or within an acceptable tolerance. And the guide goes on to discuss this in a bit more detail. So for instance, open banking is a powerful tool to support that verification. However, if it's not available, then other data sources can be drawn upon. For instance, the Credit Reference Agency and the ONS can play an important role in this. So credit reference agencies can provide income verification tolerances. So they can take an income that's provided to them, compare it to the income that they hold on the bureau data, and provide back a tolerance status. They also hold information around secured and unsecured debt repayments. The ONS, on the other hand, has annual living costs and food surveys, so is a source of expenditure information, providing typical expenditure in different categories. So if the income and expenditure cannot be verified using any of these tools, or they show to lie outside of a tolerance, then the guide provides information on what to do in these circumstances as well. So that might typically be a referral process where further information or additional evidence is sought. So I've touched upon assessing affordability against tolerances, but one of the big issues of tolerances is setting that level around inexact information. So if a customer says they spend, let's say, £299 on food a month, but ONS data says the average is closer to 300, would we consider that an issue? If we don't consider that an issue, would it be an issue if the customer said £270 or £250? So given the ONS provides simple averages for expenditure, lenders that rely on ONS data need to set tolerances, which then, if breached, can lead to further investigation. And the guide talks through the approaches to tolerances that can be taken and the action that can be followed when a breach occurs. When we talk about buffers, we've seen evidence from FOSS and other cases show that allocating headroom is important. So, as I think mentioned in the previous section, including a stress factor can ensure that the affordability calculation captures those anticipated changes to income and expenditure. However, in addition to this, we want to be looking at including buffers on expenditure and affordability to ensure that the customer has resilience to unforeseen changes to their circumstances. So, for example, a buffer might include ensuring a minimum amount included as a discretionary expenditure, regardless of what, say, an estimated figure is provided from the ONS. So there's no prescribed way as to how buffers and tolerances should be set. But the guide describes some of the available options and provides some practical examples to support this. And then finally, I just want to talk about how the affordability module draws on learning from the wider industry experience. So for this slide, I'm going to focus on FOSS cases relating to affordability that are covered in the guide. So with the first example to discuss relating to the approach to regulation that firms adopt. So in the past, at J-Wing, we've spoken to credit unions and they've said, you know, we don't follow the guidance on assessing creditworthiness found in the FCA's Consumer Conc Sourcebook, which at first sight makes sense because credit unions are exempt. They follow the credit union's Sourcebook Creds instead, which is far less prescriptive when it comes to affordability assessments. So I think from memory, I think in the Creds, it says that credit unions should adopt an approved lending policy, but they don't go into any detail or say what the policy should contain. Whereas Conc, on the other hand, contains several pages describing the conditions under which the creditworthiness and affordability must be assessed. So what we have seen, however, is that while it's technically correct that credit unions do not have to follow Conc, there are quite a few examples of where FOSS cases have been upheld against credit unions because of their approach to assessing affordability. So while it's not a legal requirement, if a credit union embraces the Conc approach, it's suggested as good practice and mitigates the risk of complaints, reputational damage, and any scrutiny from the regulators that can arise from unaffordable lending. A second example, the guide also talks about the misconception that just because somebody has a large gross income, it means that they must also have a significant disposable income. So we've seen examples where this has occurred, where the borrower may have a really, really good salary, but they have a lot of other debts, they have poor money management, there may be evidence of some gambling problems, so they don't have the capacity to support further lending. And it is not an example of good practice to rely on just that large salary provided. So finally, as the guide notes, every customer is different and every loan is different. So a customer's circumstances can be expected to change over time. So it's not appropriate to assume that because they had a certain amount of disposable income a few months ago when the initial loan was taken out, they still have that level of disposable income today when a new loan is applied for. So it's really important that a full assessment of creditworthiness is undertaken each time a new or extended credit facility is provided. So I hope that gives you sort of a few examples and being able to give you a small taste of what the affordability module of the guide covers. And I'm now going to hand back to Steve to provide a similar demonstration for one of the other modules, and then there'll be further opportunities for questions. Thank you.
Okay, no, thank you very much, Lydia. So I'm going to now spend the next few minutes going into a similar level of detail about one of the other modules, and this time one that covers the consumer duty and also complaints handling. So as before with the affordability module, this module starts with an introduction, a simple introduction explaining what consumer duty is and the core principles and the target outcomes that the duty aims to achieve. This module also covers the treatment of vulnerable customers and complaints handling. We see that as related topics, so we bring those in here. And very importantly, we talk about monitoring of consumer duty. And it's important to remember that things aren't static. Customers, products, business activities and processes change over time. So just because you are compliant with duty today doesn't mean you will be tomorrow. And that principle applies across a huge range of activities in the consumer lending environment. You know, monitoring of what you're doing and how that is and your performance against agreed targets is always important. So monitoring of the duty is very important. As with other areas of the guide, this module contains many practical examples, and so we try and present what we view as examples of good practice and poor practice against the outcomes that we're trying to achieve through compliance with the duty. Okay, so as we did with the affordability guide, we're going to describe 4 subtopics within consumer duty that the guide covers. As with the affordability module that Lydia talked about earlier, we are only going to scratch the surface of what's covered. So really it's just a few examples that will hopefully provide some insight into what the full module covers. And as with the affordability, what you see here is a simplified representation to a presentation. The full module is much more detailed. It's more document type format with lots of detailed illustrations and text supporting that. So the 4 things we're going to do is we're going to begin by just saying a simple introduction. What are the 4 outcomes, and look at those. That's sort of introductory. We'll then move on to provide some practical insights into what good practice can look like in a number of areas in terms of delivering against the 4 outcomes, and we say do that through a set of examples. And then finally, we'll come back to this topic of monitoring, and we'll talk about monitoring against one of the outcomes in particular. Okay, so the guide starts with a simple introduction about what the 4 outcomes are that we're trying to achieve, and it presents each of them in the context of the different stages of the product life cycle. So consumer duty isn't something that is fixed at a particular point in the consumer journey. It begins very much at the product design stage. So how to ensure that when you design a new product, it's going to deliver against the 4 outcomes. When customers apply for a new loan product, ensuring that customers are being directed towards the products that are appropriate for them, they're provided with any support they need, and are given an understanding of the products they are applying for, so they know what they're getting into. And then during the course of the agreement, so once a loan's been granted and the loan is progressing, it's important that customers receive the right treatment throughout that period. So that's whether the loan is performing or if it's in arrears. Both of those require due consideration. And this together means taking a consumer-centric approach. Each customer is different, with different needs, capabilities, and understanding. So let's just talk about an example in the guide that goes across these 4 outcomes. So this is an example that's included. If we imagine a firm that is offering 2 types of loan, the product features of the 2 loans are broadly the same, but one is targeted at high-risk customers with an APR of 39%. The other is targeted at lower-risk customers with an APR of 15%. So we've got a high-risk product, 39%, a low-risk product at 15%. The customer goes onto the company's website and applies for the higher risk product with the 39% APR. However, they are not a high risk customer. If they'd applied for the lower risk product with the 19% APR, then they would have been eligible for that. So what should the company do? What should happen in that circumstance to comply with the duty? So one example of a good outcome would be something along these lines. So initially, the company should, at as early a stage as possible in the application process, assess the customer's risk profile and come to a view of that. Having identified then that the customer is low risk, they should acknowledge that the customer is eligible for the lower risk product, the 14% APR product, and then make that offer to the customer. They should offer the customer the lower risk product rather than the higher risk product that they had originally applied for. The customer should then also tell the customer why they're being offered that different product, why they're being given the lower APR product. This then helps them understand the reason they were able to get a better deal than the one they applied for, and hence, with that education, they're better positioned to be able to seek out better value products in the future, whether from this lender or from another provider. Okay, so this slide shows an example in the guide relating to the development of a new credit product, which has been developed by the fictional All Welcome Credit Union. We use All Welcome as an example in a number of places. So this is a product that the All Welcome Credit Union are looking to develop. The credit union's come up with 3 different loan products that it's thinking about taking to market. And the guide gives a view of what both good and bad practice looks like when they're going through the design process. So if we look at what good practice means, That's when the firm has made reasonable attempts to understand customer needs and level of understanding and taking the requirements of vulnerable customers into account. And then that understanding informs how the credit union designs the product to provide those customers with appropriately priced products that deliver good value for them. In this example, the firm has used focus groups to gather customer feedback and inform the product design process. However, other means of gathering information are also covered in the guide. So, for example, customer surveys or profiling of the existing customer base. And the existing customer base is often a good source of information if there is a reasonable number of a reasonable amount of history there to go at. I mean, for the poor practice example, and I've seen this in practice a number of times, products are effectively designed purely by the internal credit team, based only on expert opinion without wider consultation or consideration of customer requirements. And that means there could be a mismatch between the credits being offered and what the customers need. And that in turn also increases the risk of customers not understanding what they're being offered and hence non-compliance with the duty. Okay. Now this example, again, another example in the guide, one of many, is about when something's gone wrong with the firm's promotional activities. And this has resulted in customers being misinformed about the benefits of a product. And that could result in harm. This is because they end up being charged a different amount to what the advertising is telling them. So the advertising is incorrect in how it positions the product and presents the repayment terms. Now, in both examples of good and poor practice, the lender fixes the problem straight away. The advertising no longer shown. Future advertising is fully aligned to what the product terms and conditions are. However, stopping at that point would be poor practice. To demonstrate good practice, in this example, the lender also does the following. So they first of all examine their customer base and identify which customers may have been impacted and the level of any harm that may have been caused. So that level of harm could simply be that some customers paid too much, or it could relate to incorrect arrears of being calculated and being applied, and the knock-on impacts that those arrears could have caused to those customers. Having identified customers that have been impacted, they then communicate with those customers. They apologise for their mistake, and they make redress if any harm, financial or otherwise, has resulted. So they put right any wrongs that have occurred. So just spotting the mistake would have been and fixing it. Yeah, they need to do that, but that's not enough to deliver good outcomes for the consumer. Move on. Oh, sorry, finally, no, go back. I've missed a point. So finally, the one other thing they should do, of course, is following redress, they should undertake a review of their processes and understand what went wrong to delivering the misleading advert in the first place, and then address that gap that they found, address the problem that caused that to happen so that it doesn't happen again in the future. And that is very important that they do that, otherwise the thing could well happen again. So what this slide and the previous slide both demonstrate is the learning by example approach that the guide often applies. It's not just about quoting regulations without giving also the practical context within which those regs apply. Sorry, we can now move on. I'm done on that one. Now move on. Right, okay. So this final slide, I want to talk a little bit about the monitoring of consumer duty. And the guide talks through the ways that consumer duty compliance can be monitored to ensure that good outcomes continue to be delivered as circumstances change. Firms therefore need to assess how they're performing against each of the outcomes. And this example focuses on the customer support outcome. And a key feature here is that a good monitoring regime looks holistically across the business, across different channels, systems and processes that are in place. So if we take call monitoring, that's great to monitor the quality of calls and how those calls are being undertaken. But if all one does is call monitoring, then there's a significant risk of failing to identify issues that might arise via other routes. So a holistic approach looking at all the different channels and processes is important. Firms should also set performance targets and thresholds with their monitoring, together with plans of actions that should a tolerance or threshold be breached. So we take call wait times as an example, then maybe there is a target pickup time, say maybe within 30 seconds. And that's the target the company believes needs to be met to help the support outcome be achieved. If the average wait time exceeds the pre-agreed target of 30 seconds, say exceeds 45 seconds, then the board may task the operations manager to undertake a root cause analysis and then produce an action plan to bring the wait times back down to within acceptable levels. So that cycle of monitoring and review, examining tolerances and RAG statuses against which actions are then taken is a key part of monitoring. And we expand upon that in the monitoring module, and we also have areas on that in the governance module too. So hopefully that's just given you, again, just a little flavour of what's in the customer duty module. And we've covered also a little bit on the affordability module. And I'm now going to hand back to Diane, who's going to talk to you a bit more about some of the other initiatives that the guide is being used to support. So back to you, Diane.
Thanks, Lydia and Steve, for walking us through so much content in such a short space of time. Whilst you've been doing that, we've had a few questions, so we'll try and cover a couple of those. So first one we've got is, and I can probably pick this one up, why is the guide mainly aimed at the community finance sector? So we've put this guide together with a focus on making it relevant for the community finance sector, as it's most closely aligned with one of our strategic goals at Fair4All of increasing affordable credit provision and the organisations that we currently support to deliver on that. However, it's an open resource, as we've already said, so it's available to any organisation that wishes to use it and can get value from using it. So that covers that one. We've got another question. Thanks for sharing the two deep dives. What other areas of the guide would you say are important to focus on? So I'm going to come to Steve. I'm going to come to you first on this one, and then perhaps Lydia, you could give us your view on that too.
Ooh, that's a difficult one, Dan, because I think they've all got relevance in certain areas, but I think two I'd probably pick out is, I think the risk appetite module's quite a good one. It's quite short and concise in its subject matter, but so it's a good one to have a quick read of. But I think what we've seen with organisations is sometimes they're not really aligned in terms of what their risk appetite is. So what are the boundaries within which they're willing to operate? What levels of risk are they willing to lend to in relation, and then lining it up with their actual lending policy? So the credit risk appetite is the high level strategic statement of the boundaries within which you're willing to operate to deliver your business objectives. And then detailed policies, lending policy around affordability and credit risk, are designed to work within that framework that's been set in risk appetite. So that's important, I think. I also think I think the credit risk module is a good one. I think what we often see as well is organisations sometimes put too much emphasis on either just the credit risk or just affordability. So I think ensuring that you've got a balanced perspective on both of those is important. So if you only focus on one, you will miss something, and there's risks there. So yeah, the credit risk and the credit risk appetite probably for me.
Brilliant, thanks, Steve. How about you, Lydia?
Yeah, so I think thinking about it, I think Steve's covered one of mine, which was the credit risk, but I do think application process is another key one. I think it's really good for kind of bringing everything together, so it takes the from the customer journey, from application all the way through to sort of accept, reject and post application. So it's really good for what we try and do within that one is kind of high level elements within each part of the journey, but also signpost to the different modules. So if you're unsure of where to look and which module to start with, that is a really good one for kind of taking you, if you're reading it through from start to end, you can think, right, I'll look at this module now for this step and this step. So I think that's really, really useful for that element as well. So they were going to be my two. And if I had to pick another one, it would probably be credit reference agencies as well. That's a really useful tool for kind of looking at exactly what they do, because we reference the credit reference agencies quite a lot in all the different modules and how they can help with certain areas. So that one sort of on a standalone provides quite a lot of information on all the benefits and the data that they can provide. So that'd probably be my other one as well.
Great, thanks, Lydia.
Thanks, Dan.
We've just got one other question that I think I can cover before we start to wrap up. So the question here says, you mentioned earlier about a volatile marketplace. How regularly will the guide be updated to reflect this? Well, I was going to kind of answer that in my wrap up, but I can answer it now. So we'll look to update the guide periodically to make sure we're staying as up to date as we can with both those key market changes and key regulatory changes. And of course, any feedback that any of you can give us, is welcomed in terms of how we can continue to develop the content as we go on. So I'll kind of wrap up there for questions for now. To wrap us up for today, we just wanted to touch on some further support we're looking at to offer to the community finance sector following the launch of this guide. We're thinking about some further deep dives on other modules and also some workshops with smaller groups to practically work through topic areas specific to your credit union or CDFI. So please, again, do let us know either in the chat or by dropping us a line after this session to tell us what would be useful to cover in these follow-up sessions, and really any other ideas for making best use of the content within the guide, because we're really aiming to bring the content to life as much as we possibly can. The slides will be posted with a recording of this session on the website. We've created a dedicated page within our resources section where you can view or download the various modules or other supporting materials. So it just remains for me to say many thanks to the JWing team for joining us and everyone that's been involved in helping pull this guide together. Most of all, we really appreciate you all coming along on this warm day to listen all about this, and we hope you found this introduction to the guide, very useful. And enjoy the rest of your day.